Creating a tutorial on a specific capture the flag challenge, like h.a.c.k.e.d basilic upon, involves a few steps. Since I don't have access to specific challenges, I will guide you through a generic Flask application that could be vulnerable to common challenges, specifically focusing on the typical vulnerabilities you might encounter in such challenges. Overview: in this tutorial, we'll create a simple Flask application that simulates a vulnerable web application. The goal is to understand how to identify and exploit some common vulnerabilities. Prerequisites 1. Python. Ensure you have Python installed 3.6 or higher. Flask. Install Flask if you haven't already. Bash pip install Flask 3. Basic knowledge: familiarity with Python and web application concepts. Setting up the Flask app. Let's create a basic Flask application. Create a new directory for your project: bash h.a.c.k.e.d basilic 2. Create the Flask application. Create a file named app.python from Flask. Import Flask. Request render template string app Flask. Name a simple HTML template with a form HTML template. Doc type HTML. Title: vulnerable app title home. Welcome to the h.a.c.k.e.d basilic. Run the Flask application. Run the application with bash python app. Visit ep1 127.00.15,000 in your browser to see the application. Vulnerabilities in the application. This application has a few common vulnerabilities that could be the basis of h.a.c.k.e.d challenge 1. Hard-coded credentials. The application checks for hard-coded credentials. Admin password. Lack of input validation. The application does not validate or sanitize the user input. Debug mode. Running Flask in debug mode exposes the internal workings of the application. Exploiting the vulnerabilities. Here are some common attack vectors you might explore in h.a.c.k.e.d context. 1. Brute force. Attempt to brute force the username and password fields due to the lack of rate limiting. Injection attacks. If the application used user input in slaries or shell commands, you could exploit those vulnerabilities. Debug mode. Since the application is running in debug mode, you can expose the Python shell and potentially execute arbitrary code. Example of brute forcing the credentials: you can use a simple script to brute force the credentials. Username. Password. Conclusion: in this tutorial, we built a basic Flask application that simulates vulnerabilities you might encounter in h.a.c.k.e.d challenge. We discussed some common vulnerabilities and how they can be exploited. This is a foundational example, and you can expand upon it by adding more features, vulnerabilities, or even integrating it with other tools commonly used in h.a.c.k.e.d challenges. Important note: always remember that practicing security testing should be done in a legal and ethical manner. Ensure you have permission to test any applications or networks you work with, and only perform these activities in a controlled environment or on applications you own.